All right. So welcome back, everyone. My name's Liesl Eberhardt, and I'm your professor for this course.
And I'm Shanna Maldonado. I am the TA for this course. So we'll be laying the groundwork for everything we'll cover this semester. So let's begin.
So we are going to before we get into some of this theory, we want to do a little quick exercise. And this is something I did in class when this was on campus. So what we want you to do is think about one thing that women do well as leaders and one thing they struggle with, and take just a minute to jot that down.
Now go ahead and do the same for men, which is one strength and one weakness. And don't overthink it, just write down your initial reaction or what you first think of.
Okay, you can pause us if you haven't gotten this down yet, but once you have those, ask yourself, where did those impressions come from? Has to do with our stereotypes, and that's what we're kind of going to get to. Our scripts, our schemas that we assign to gender, and what this means for equality and opportunity, which is a big theme in this class.
And even more, why does this conversation matter in the first place? And that's really the question that we're building toward in this course.
Excellent. So, our challenge that we're setting for ourselves as we kind of embark on this journey together is let's stop getting this wrong. This slide features a quote, and this is from Jody Detton. I hope that she's a professor of management at Suffolk University. And this really sets the tone for our chapter, especially chapter 1.
And the core idea here is that we often use biology to justify bias. So we take stereotypical gender roles and map them into our leadership expectations, and then we judge anyone who falls outside of those norms more harshly.
Denton's challenge is to stop thinking about binary boxes. Stop putting people in boxes, because the problems we're facing as a society are too big to solve without empowering everybody to lead. Not just half of us. We want everybody to feel that they have an equal opportunity to step into leadership roles.
Exactly. And so this isn't just a woman issue, it's an all of us issue. And that's the frame we'll carry through this semester and as we explore more of this topic.
So let's talk numbers. Women still earn about 80% of their male counterparts, and only a small percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. And obviously, that's 500 people. So if you have a small percentage of those people making it to that top CEO level, then those numbers haven't moved dramatically in about 20 years. We're not, and with women being 50% of the population, but far less than 50% of those reaching that highest level CEO, that's a problem.
Most definitely. And even further, Powell argues that the bigger challenge isn't the statistics themselves, it's actually the myth of equality. So a lot of people believe that we've already arrived and that gender discrimination is basically solved.
And that's where the optimistic versus pessimistic lens comes in. Optimists see change and progress and say we've come a long way, where pessimists really see that our glass half empty, I should say, and feel that we haven't come as far as we really should have, and look at what yet needs to be done. A realist, and they're realists, depending on who you ask. So inequality still becomes deeply entrenched in our institutions from this realistic view.
Most definitely. And so this slide here also introduces sex versus gender, which we'll unpack more shortly. And Sandra Bem's gender schema theory from 1981 states that the idea that we learn from our culture, which traits get labeled as masculine or feminine, and all of it shapes how we are evaluated for the rest of our lives.
And Kathleen Hall Jamieson out of the University of Pennsylvania looked at the double bind, which is how we negatively assess women. You can't be both feminine and competent, because there's an incompatibility to being feminine and competent. We're going to come back to that more later in the semester and take a deeper dive at the double bind. Now, this video you're going to be doing in your weekly discussion board activity. You're going to take a look at the former CFO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, in your discussion board activity, looking at why we have too few female leaders. And this is an old TED Talk, but it still has a lot of really good themes. So, okay, so what is cultural hegemony? It is the set process for which a dominant culture holds on to power. And it does this through systems, through institutions, through education, advertising, policy, media, and religion. And so this hegemonic structure stays in place through formalized systems of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And a specific version of this hegemonic masculinity is that the idea that masculinity and maleness get promoted as part of the dominant culture.
Thank you. So, what does this mean for leadership opportunities for women? Think about examples where masculine traits get treated as default. So, women are seen as outside leadership opportunities because they are outside the default of masculinity. And when you think leadership, you think male. So, when you think what a leader looks like, you automatically default to a position of masculinity and maleness.
Now, this slide gives us three metaphors for the barriers women face in their careers, and the evolution between them is extremely telling.
The glass ceiling metaphor, I'm sure you've heard of. And obviously, as you can picture it, it describes this barrier that is rigid and impenetrable, but invisible, somewhat invisible. And so women can see where they want to go, but they can't really get there and they can't really get through.
And absolutely, and the problem is that this metaphor doesn't fully capture the modern experience anymore because barriers today are more penetrable, and so women are gaining access just unevenly and with a lot more friction.
That's right. So we need something to kind of capture the true essence of what women are experiencing today. And so the labyrinth was some kind of a metaphor that for a modern woman's experience. Alice Eagley coined this metaphor in her research out of Northwestern, and it captures kind of more varied and indirect paths women travel, sometimes through unfamiliar territory on their way to leadership positions.
That one's great. And then on top of that, we have the jungle gym metaphor. And this one is about reframing career paths altogether. So instead of a single ladder where it goes straight up, your career can move sideways, backwards, in different directions, and you can still get to where you want to go.
That's right. And this one was none other than Sheryl Sandberg who came up with this one, doing her research looking at Lean In, which was a book that she did, trying to work with women who, again, weren't reaching the top. And she was really interested in looking at that phenomenon. So that's important to understand. The real question the chapter poses is what would you do if you weren't afraid to take one of these less direct paths? So think about that for your own journey, both men and women in this class. Think about what you would do on your path to leadership, because again, this class is about equal opportunity for everyone in attaining leadership, not leadership opportunities.
Great. And so here on this slide, we have some of the research we'll dig into over the next few weeks. So current numbers on the Fortune 500 women CEOs, the page gap by race, and how many countries worldwide have elected a woman head of state at least once.
So, spoiler, the US isn't one of them. We thought we might have one in 2016, and I know I can speak for myself and say I was really excited. And then again in 2024, did not happen either time. So, one of the things we may ask you to ruminate on is when do you think we might have one? But we'll look at these sources together and talk about what they tell us about who we are in America and our resistance to female leadership, what they do and don't tell us about where we actually stand. So, on the psychology of sex, let's go a little deeper into these numbers. So, as of 2025, women earn about 85% of what men earn on average, and 55, we talked about Fortune 500 a little while ago. 55 of those 500 CEOs are women. So remember I said half the population are women, but far less than 500 of those CEOs are women. Well, the truth is it's 55 of the Fortune 500 as of 2025 are women. So and that's celebrated as a record high. It's the first time that number's crossed 10%. So think about that 55 is celebrated as a record high, and that's just 10%. Again, the population of women is over half. So not necessarily what we would call equality in terms of representation.
Yeah, I most definitely agree. And when you think about it, just over a tenth, and although it is a record high, it's hard to argue that there's been a lot of real momentum, especially given that women make up more than half the population, just as you said, and nearly half of the workforce.
Exactly, exactly. So again, when we talk about being pessimist versus optimist or glass half full versus glass half empty, thinking about how far we've come, it can be somewhat tempting to be pessimistic. But in this class, we're going to examine a lot of things and perhaps try to be optimistic, but at the same time, be realistic in order to think about the things we still need to tackle and the things that could be improved on. So Powell calls the belief that we've already solved this, again, as you said, Shanna, the myth of equality. It's a belief a lot of students kind of walk into this class with, and sometimes even push back on some of the data. I've had students in the past who really haven't wanted to believe that things are the way they are, with a real reluctance to hear about things such as wage gaps or glass ceilings, because they feel like it's old news and that we really are moving into a more modern era where things are truly more fair than they are.
Well, and so our goal then this semester isn't to convince you of one particular view, it's to look at the data together with an open mind and to figure out what kind of future we actually want to build.
That's right.
So,
When we think historically, this kind of shift towards exclusion that was later coined as the glass ceiling kind of started in the 70s, and Wall Street Journal coined the phenomenon by the article by Heimowitz and Schellenhard in 1986.
Congress actually created a glass ceiling commission in 1995 and specifically to study this phenomenon.
So, more detail on the labyrinth metaphor that we discussed earlier. Uh, Kind of a fuller definition is the labyrinth seeks to capture varied challenges women face as they travel these indirect paths that are, as we said, through sometimes what are sometimes unfamiliar territories as they're on the way to leadership positions.
And so this chapter walks us through three specific barriers we'll unpack, which is the concrete wall, the glass ceiling, and the labyrinth itself. So let's take a look at them one at a time.
Okay. So the key idea in the labyrinth is that those paths to the top are there, but as in the metaphor of a labyrinth, they're hard to find. Some women find them, but they can be genuinely hard to discover.
And so the labyrinth contains a mix of obvious and subtle barriers, and the women who navigate it successfully do so despite not because the barriers weren't there.
So that's right. And the barrier is really a symbol and symbolic for how complex the causes of women's leadership situations can be. And they actually are. And it's not one single wall, it's a maze trying to navigate to the top.
Now, before there was a glass ceiling, there was something much more blunt, and that is the concrete wall. The most effective way is to block someone from leadership, and it is to block them outright with a tangible, explicit barrier. And that's what the concrete wall is.
So, for most of human history, that's exactly what happened. Through policy, law, and societal norms, as we mentioned earlier with the hegemonic structure, women were treated as property. They were excluded from legal and political decision making up until as late as I believe, oh my gosh, was it the 70s or 80s? You're going to have to check me on that, everyone. But women couldn't even get a credit card without a male cosigner. So, this is examples of the concrete wall.
Yeah, well, even further, even after women won the right to vote in 1920, plenty of less explicit barriers remain, just like how you said with the woman getting a credit card. And so when we think no women need to apply, or the framing of women's biological role as homemaker versus men as the breadwinner, and when we think of the social norms and everything else that falls into place with these less explicit barriers.
Yeah, now the wall came down eventually, but what replaced it, we've got the glass ceiling, the labyrinth, the jungle gym. These are really just less visible versions of the same underlying dynamic, and that is blocking women from leadership and still problematic. So, sex versus gender is an important distinction that we'll use all semester. Sex is biological and physiological, while gender is a social construction and something that we learn to perform.
And even further, when studying sex differences, it means looking at how males and females are actually biologically different. So, studying gender differences means looking at how people's perceptions of male and female behavior are different, which is a whole different question altogether, though.
So, for example, a sex difference in leadership style would mean female leaderships are innately more considerate of subordinates than male leaders, more nurturing, more considerate. And a gender difference would mean people believe female leaders are more considerate, whether or not that's actually true.
That's right, and even more that this matters because it can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if a supervisor believes their male and female employees have different skills or interests, their expectations can actually shape behavior until it matches that stereotype.
That's right. And three concepts we'll keep coming back to are stereotyping, which is a shortcut set of beliefs about a group, and then prejudice, which is an assigned negative attitude towards that group, and also discrimination, which is the actual behavior and decision making based on that assigned attitude.
So now let's talk about how diversity gets categorized. So primary dimensions are highly visible and largely unchangeable, and that is sex, race, ethnicity, and physical ability.
Secondary dimensions are less visible, can be hidden, and are more changeable. So this can be something like your education, your income, your marital status, your religion.
And then we have sex, which is a primary dimension, and this is highly visible and cannot be changed. It's actually the very first thing people notice about us, and it shapes how every other dimension of our identity gets read and interpreted by others.
So when researchers study gender, they have to be really careful because the intersectionality of sex, gender, race, age, and other variables can produce results that can be easy to misinterpret.
Now, this is a good place to introduce Alice Eagly's role congruity theory, and this is the idea that we react negatively to people who violate the gender norms we expect them to follow in or out of the workplace.
Yes, and this has a lot to do with why women are perceived as less effective in leadership roles. So there are two types of bias worth knowing, and that's alpha bias, which exaggerates sex differences in research, and beta biases, which minimizes or completely ignores them. And researchers can unconsciously bring alpha bias into their own work.
Yeah. And so the big takeaway is that there are guards against assumptions. And so just because sex or a sex difference shows up in the data doesn't mean it applies to every man or woman. And it doesn't mean it's fixed biology either. Gender is fluid and social influences shape a lot of what looks natural.